And we're back. Welcome to Abstractable. I'm Lockie and this is Ryan. And this podcast for people like us who are curious about the world around them. In this episode, we talk about the book The Black Swan by Nassim Nicholas Taleb.
And what do we cover?
We cover a lot.
We do. A lot of ground. We talk about Nassim and his upbringing and where he got his really good manners from, or should I say not so good manners. We discuss what is a black swan and how you can avoid them or seek them out should you wish to do so. We discuss the various shortcomings that we all have in our own minds, such as the narrative fallacy. This is a truly action-packed and dense book. You can find Nassim on NN Taleb on Twitter. He loves running amok on that place. And also his website, foolbyrandomness.com. As always, plenty of meandering conversation in this one. We hope you enjoy.
Episode 2. Don't you bloody laugh. Oh, no, I'm laughing. Sorry. That was one of our notes today.
So I didn't laugh then, mate.
I know.
You notice that? And normally it's my laughter which drowns out everything that's going on.
Yeah, so one of our notes is no nervous giggling today, which I've already broken, so that's great. What book are we doing?
We're doing The Black Swan.
Wow.
By Nassim Nicholas Taleb.
One of the best books I've ever read, I think.
Yeah.
Which is pretty cool. Like, I've read a fair few books now, but this one's an absolute mind blower, I think.
You're on target for how many books this year, Lockie? 40?
40, yeah.
Yeah.
Some of them I listen to a lot of them, so don't. Before you give me applause, it's kind of cheating, but I feel like it still counts, right?
I don't think it's cheating at all. Like,
I think the other thing is, like, book is like a really arbitrary measure. Like, if a lot of people just listen to the radio and probably consume, or a podcast and consume almost as much information. So
certainly as much listening. You probably don't get as much out of it because I think a book is a little bit more curated than. So
do you think that? Do you think that it's actually better to read more books than to perhaps just listen to podcasts? I do.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, absolutely. Because
it's a packaged piece of information, isn't it?
Podcasts, there's a lot of entertainment value and kind of, sure, you get to discover some new ideas, you get to hear conversations go in particular ways, but I think there's something more for us in listening to podcasts that's not about the knowledge. Whereas
there's no time for fun though in this world, so we need to be learning all the time. So.
We say that very lightly. I was going to say that on the knowledge piece, though, I find that when I've finished listening to a book or had a session listening to a book, I kind of feel like drained a little bit.
Well, we were talking about this earlier today, that there are certain types of books that are better to listen to, I believe. And it seems to be, for me, something that's got a real narrative that's weaving through it. If it's really too dense, it actually gets harder to listen to. However, I did listen to this book and actually found that pretty good. And it's not necessarily a story, this one, The Black Swan.
This was, this book, it has narrative, right? But I think this book for me disqualifies as a book that I would listen to in the future, because I also listen to it. Because I think it was just so dense with information.
But is it? Well, let me put it this way: would you have finished reading it if you didn't listen to it? That's the other thing to think about. Like, it is a real dense thing, so maybe we would have never gotten through it. I don't know.
That's a valid point.
Yeah. Well, maybe we can get some feedback on that for those out there.
We got through Thinking Fast and Slow in the end.
I did.
Hey, I got there too.
Did you finish it?
Yeah, I finished it.
Good. Yeah.
That was the requirement before me re-recording it the fourth time.
Yeah. So we have recorded this episode a few times too. But that was mainly when we were practicing. So now that we're professionals, it should be fine. But it is a really dense book, so we're really going to try and pull the best bits out of it.
So yeah, I think it's important to highlight from the get-go that this will undoubtedly be controversial because Nassim likes to throw grenades, and I likely won't be able to help myself but cross the line in saying something inadvertently or quoting him and being misrepresented.
It's worth the risk, though.
It is so worth the risk.
And the idea of this podcast is that we're going to bring interesting information forward for the curious people, so like us. So let's delve into it, I reckon, because the ideas in this book pretty much changed my view on the world, I reckon. It's one of those ones.
Yeah, it's a big one.
It's a red pill book.
I
might actually.
You're going to use that?
Yeah, I'm going to use that in future episodes.
This is a red pill.
Yeah, red pill book.
What's the blue pill?
Is blue pill, which one does Neo take in the Matrix? I hope it's the red pill.
Well, you're going to have to look that up now.
Yeah, I should have done my research, but, that'll be...
Next time. So this is book 2 of 5 in his In Shadow series, all of which have now been released. The latest being Skin in the Game, which is I haven't read, but I've heard good things about.
I've started it, but I haven't got too far. I've also started Antifragile, but I haven't got too far with that either.
So I've heard decent things about Skin in the Game, but really good things about Antifragile.
The whole premise behind Antifragile is how to use the ideas in Black Swan
in
in
reality,
a more practical way.
Yeah. Because one of his Taleb's notable areas of expertise is applied. I'm going to mispronounce this. Epistemology, which is like how to apply the pursuit of knowledge, and then how to apply risk and uncertainty and approach the world in dealing with that. So
tell me about the author, mate.
Well, I was going to say that when this book was released was also the same year that the iPhone was unveiled. Seventh Harry Potter was released, and we're on the cusp of the GFC, which is a really good thing to highlight at the start of this book.
Because the book's about risk and crazy things happening when we probably don't expect them to.
Yeah. He's been coined with having predicted the GFC because he obviously wrote this book prior to the GFC, and he was certainly vocal in expressing some of the problems and inherent problems in the system and the lead up to.
I find that kind of ironic because I think a lot of his points are that not a lot of things aren't that predictable.
I think he was pointing to the fact that we're getting ourselves here into real issues because of all these corners that are getting cut and all these cutting of the tails, if you will, that we're taking in everything that we're doing, which is going to have some catastrophic consequences.
Misappropriation of risk.
Yeah.
That's what he's about. He's not about predicting specific events, but he talks a lot about how we get risk analysis wrong.
Yeah.
So I would describe it like that, I think. So, but ironically, he does kind of predict the GFC in the book.
Yeah. Same as the guy out of The Big Short, whatever his name was.
Michael Lewis, or the author, or one of the guys in there?
Not the author, the lead character.
Yeah.
Who like sees it coming and basically has the lead execs knocking on his door telling him to release all the money back to him, and they ended up making squillions of dollars as a result.
Crazy.
Yeah. So he which is really interesting to highlight because we'll definitely talk about that somewhere in the future as well. But for those who don't know, 07-08 was a global financial crisis. and we basically was off the back of the subprime mortgage issues going on in the States. We had AAA ratings of some of these things that were well and truly beyond AAA ratings. And then we had the crash of Lehman Brothers, Bear Stearns, and some big unbreakable banks and institutions. It was really interesting, mate, because we speak a lot about Naval.
Yeah.
And Naval and him had a recent fireside chat, I think last year, at BlockCon, which is centered around blockchain. And
fair to say Naval's a big fan of Nassim's work, so it's cool that they could get together. And can you find it on YouTube or is it a podcast?
Yeah, YouTube.
Yeah,
definitely YouTube, Nassim and Naval, and it will probably pop straight up. I consider
looking forward to that.
I consider Naval to be he articulates himself very well. He's very sort of coherent in the way he tells things, which is why his podcast, for those of you who haven't listened to it, is very valuable, very powerful. Nassim, on the other hand, you'd probably say is on the other end of the scale in terms of how he's able to portray himself vocally, or in my opinion, I feel like he's not a vocal presenter as such, even though he no doubt lectures across numerous institutions.
He doesn't have that entertainment factor.
Yeah.
Or maybe bringing the message to the people, do you think?
Or maybe just pushes the entertainment factor a little bit too hard.
Really? Because when I've heard him interviewed, he's fairly blunt and it's not, he doesn't kind of really give much in terms of his body language and those sort of things.
Like there is a bluntness, but he tries to overemphasize some of the humor.
It's not actually funny.
Yeah. That's the issue.
Can relate to that.
But it was quite interesting because Naval really just let Nassim speak the entire time, because that's kind of what he wanted to get out of it, and asked a few questions, threw in a couple of tidbits. But the whole focus was to summarize the collective of ideas that sit within the Black Swan and the Incerto series. So great watch.
I will be watching that. I have not seen it and I'm looking forward to it.
I want your thoughts in the next session.
We might do a little fireside chat of our own about the fireside chat.
It might be a good idea.
An abstract chat, if you will.
But biggest quote that came out of that: you don't want to win an argument. You just want to win. So the point of that being people getting totally consumed in arguments and virtue signaling for the sake of the argument.
So explain virtue signaling.
Again, I think a big one that Naval harps on is around portraying yourself to be virtuous just for the sake of portraying that to others and sort of propping yourself up in status. Whereas when maybe push comes to shove, you're not actions speak a lot louder than words.
So is it something like when someone has a view you don't really agree with, that's say a really conservative view, calling them a Nazi would be a virtue signal?
It would be more, there's a situation that you've seen on the news, let's say,
whale gets hunted or...
Yeah, okay, let's go. Yeah, so there's a whale that gets hunted by the Japanese, and...
While you're enjoying your shark fin soup, you're shouting at the TV. Is
correct,
that right?
Yeah.
Or you're on Twitter.
You're eating a piece of flake from the fish and chippery, and we're having some whale sashimi in front of you. And you're yelling at the TV and talking to your mate over here, who says... saying how much of an atrocity that is. Certainly an extreme example, but the point is,
and we do not condone that, obviously.
Yeah. So. The point of it being that typically it's just a showing vocally, as opposed to the actual actions that that
Gotcha.
followed.
Yep. So it's saying I'm a good person because I think this is. But you're not. Your actions don't necessarily follow it up.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So, Nassim?
Just want to win. So don't get stuck in the roundabout of argument and arguing for the sake of arguing. Care about the truth and bring it back into your life and do something.
And I think it's a pretty like Nassim way to put it.
Is that fair?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think it's a pretty Nassim way to put it though, like win, the whole like.
He's combative. He is a combative person.
That's it. That's the word.
Yeah.
Combative. Very, very combative. I'm pulling out my green
I
tea
should
bag
have
because
provided you with something to put
like a
that
little
tea
cup.
bag in.
Because I feel like if I don't,
It's kind of weirdly sitting on the edge of the cup. So I'm gonna leave mine in there.
you're a game man.
This man, Nassim Nicholas Taleb.
Yeah. So Lebanon is where he was born. His family were part of the elite society. His grandfather and great-grandfather were at some point in time deputy prime minister.
Wow.
For the country. So very prestigious upbringing. Describes Lebanon as a melting pot of cultures, and he himself came from the sort of Christian portion of Lebanon. And we've got to think of this time as being, mid or just after mid 20th century. Certainly before
After World War II.
After World War II, post World War II. So, somewhat of a time of peace is really what.
Certainly the way he describes it in the book
Yeah.
is that it was quite a wonderful place to live in that early part of his life. And, everyone's childhood's a complicated time to remember. So don't know what the broader society was experiencing, but certainly he portrays it as a very peaceful place to live where there's a big melting pot of people.
Yeah. And as a result, I think he kind of rebelled against that. He had this urge, I think he says, he had an urge to get away from the James Bond types that were around. Meaning, so he was constantly hanging out with this, opulence and, money being just splashed around everywhere. Whereas he developed this real sort of rebellious nature and this sort of ascetic, not aesthetic, manner of life where he wanted to take the sort of frugal approach and
What does ascetic mean?
living with like humility is basically the way to describe it.
Not materialistic.
Yeah, not the opulence that he was coming from.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Really,
It's so strange.
really interesting.
So strange that it's such a close word to aesthetic, which is like kind of the opposite. 15 years old, he was put in jail when he was in a student riot because he supposedly hit a police officer with a slab of concrete. I note that he puts allegedly in his book in brackets. I'm not sure what that means. I'm not sure if he actually did it and he's just trying to sort of brush it off or whether he never actually did it or not.
The badass.
Yeah, you get that from the way he speaks. And the ironic thing about all of that is that his grandfather at the time was the Minister for Interior, which meant that he was the one to sign the letter to basically cease the revolt, stop the riots.
And then throughout this life, all of a sudden, everything changed in Lebanon.
Yeah. He, pretty well. I think it was like just after he got out of prison or on the cusp of getting out of prison, the war broke out. 1975. And I'm led to believe that basically ruined their prominence and their wealth and their prestigiousness within the society, because basically once in warfare, all the hierarchy just consolidates, particularly the nature of what they were going through.
The Civil War.
Yeah, the Civil War. And this was like, I think this was like an integral kind of forming couple of years for him, because he said the experiences of the war had a first-hand impact on him in the sense that it kind of sowed the seed for Black Swan events in his mind. He remembers looking out at the night sky in a blackout during the war, looking at the stars and recalling being told that the planets were in equilibrium, by his teachers back in school, and so that they would never crash into the earth. He then also remembers putting this together with the unique historical stability that was always preached about in Lebanon. And at the time, there was mortars, there was, tracer rounds and things flying through the sky. You can imagine the scene.
Everything's in equilibrium until it isn't.
Yeah. And so the words he used is, he said that really bothered him. and he didn't know what to believe.
Wow. It's a pretty profound thing to think. I'm not sure I'd be thinking that.
No. Well, the reason he was sort of looking at the sky is because it was like a hobby of some of the community and the society. The civilians it was more during the war because there was constant blackouts across the entire city.
Of course,
power-outs.
Yeah. You could see the stars.
People would go to one side of the city, which was kind of the furthest away from all the action and violence, but was still like within mortar range. And so run the risk of, being blown up so you could look at the stars and see all the firefights that were going on.
Wow.
I don't think he was too keen on that either.
So that must have been the start of his delving into randomness. And it probably culminates in this book.
Yeah, well, this is it almost seems like that was kind of one of the major inflection points for the 30-year journey that has been to bring the Black Swan out. So pretty cool. And then he obviously moved on from there to Paris and the United States, and he's got a whole array of qualifications. I think he's able to read in 10 different languages. So he's a pretty smart guy.
His bent is more mathematics, though. Yeah. He's certainly a mathematical person and spends a lot of his time actually practicing theoretical maths.
Yeah, and this is a really...
But he's a student of history too and reads a lot of philosophy. It's littered throughout his books. But, yeah, his founding is in quantitative mathematics, I would describe.
Yeah, but it's really important, right, to highlight that he emphasizes that he started out life as a trader. He was on the floor, he's on the tools, he's in the mix. And that he believes in feeling the thing you're doing, that sort of, you can't learn from behind a desk talking to your fellow lecturers. You got to be out there doing something to fully understand it. Yeah.
And then you can apply knowledge to it, but until you feel it with your own hands, you won't know.
Yeah.
I reckon that is massive for him. And it's littered throughout a lot of the other stuff we have read too. And it's one of the founding principles of like the Toyota way and lean manufacturing and as well, interestingly.
From construction, our construction lives, to bring that in for a second, is always there's always this emphasis to start out on site, and be either on the tools or be very closely watching the action that's going on, on a daily basis, totally immersed in understanding, so that when you potentially rise through
to respect the person who does it.
Correct.
Don't think you know better because you've just come out of 4 years of engineering school doing equations. Doesn't mean a thing, really. It means something, but less than you think.
I heard something recently about that on doctors, right? And I can't recall who said it, but it was basically, there was a lot of doctors that were coming out, of their 4 to 6 years or more of study, and basically coming out straight into the workforce. I think it was probably more the 4 years of hard study and then coming out as interns into
because they do integration into hospitals. Yeah,
correct. And then coming out and being seen to feel like they know as if what's going on, and then someone comes in who's a little bit older, having done all this research across Google and all the various MD platforms and things, and comes in with a couple of thoughts around what they might be suffering or the diagnosis for, and kind of that all just been battered away for the sort of standard clinical, not even clinical, the standard theoretical approach from what they've been taught through uni, and end up being wrong like every single time. Really interesting. So it's kind of like that both the humility in it and also the experience of the actually being in it and being immersed in it.
Yeah, it's interesting. Just like qualifications as a general idea is, certainly throughout this book, one of the things I've learned is that not to undervalue the apprenticeship style of learning. It's almost preferable in a lot of cases, I think where possible.
I think that is like the best education. Is kind of the more that I'm learning and going through both my own discoveries, it's like that apprentice way of learning is like for sure the best way. And it's not limited to trades.
No,
it's not limited to the traditional forms of apprenticeships. It's anything.
It's a little bit dependent on, I've done some thinking about this, and I think it's a little bit dependent on complexity and risk, I think. So, for example, you're not going to, what's the best way to teach someone to play basketball? I think I've talked about this before, but you're not going to sit them in a lecture theatre and explain how to bounce the ball. You're going to throw them a basketball and go shoot some hoops, aren't you? But that's also not super complex. It can get complex as you go into the game, but, the fundamentals. And secondly, it's low risk, You're not going to teach someone to free rock climb by, say, up you go, head to Yosemite and climb the dorm wall, Secondly, and you're also not going to say, grab a scalpel and head into brain surgery, but see if you can work it out, because the downside's too high.
Yeah, but you might, but I think you can still, so in the trade school, right, you're not going to start by building a house. You're not going to be, say you're a builder, trade school, you're hammering in nails to build a timber frame on a house. You're not going to be starting on a house. So I think in a similar vein,
you can build the blocks.
Yeah. And
I guess that you could say that that's a bit like cutting up a cadaver.
Correct.
As an example of starting down that way. You should be leaning into that as much as possible. But you also need to know a whole heap of theoretical knowledge too. And that's the same with engineering and in some aspects, is that you need to know the principles behind it to make effective decisions too.
And this is I think the really interesting thing is that he believes that people should go from practice to theory and not theory to practice. Because when you go from theory to practice, his concern is that you've basically blinkered your way and your way of thinking, your model of the world and how things operate in that particular area. And so you are unable to see things in another way. Whereas if you're immersed in it, you have the opportunity to draw your own critical conclusions and then come out from it looking at it from a more theoretical point of view and have criticism or a point of view against it, which is amazing.
So there's a great book I read called Do No Harm by a guy called Henry Marsh, and he's a brain surgeon. And it was really interesting to hear. It's effectively his memoir. And it's just really interesting to hear about someone who's doing something that's super high risk and how you learn and how he kind of deals with everything. Because he's just constantly killing people by accident, like not that often, but often enough that
I just clicked
it's a real thing, right?
I just clicked on the title. Yeah.
And it's a really fascinating, I think we should do it here one day, because it's just an interesting insight into someone who's doing a really practical craft in a super high risk environment and how he learns and deals with deals with learning, and he kind of pioneered the type of brain surgery where the person's awake. You know.
And I imagine he wasn't ever going to get that from just reading books.
No, probably not. So, yeah, we'll park that one. But
let's come back to it. I like that. Yeah, it sounds like it also sounds similar, I imagine, to like the checklist manifesto, which is also something that we're going to have to discuss in the future.
What's that one?
It's around. I haven't read the book, but it's around. I can't recall the author either. That's terrible. But it basically talks about some of these high risk medical professions, about how they have checklists so totally integrated into the way in which they do things that the process is followed and things are done right the first time type thing.
Eliminate human error.
Eliminates human error as much as possible. Which is
what?
And human error, not just in the sense of I stuffed it up this time, but it's like I misinterpreted it this time, the biases and the heuristics and things that come into it. So
yeah, cool.
Really interesting.
So tell me about Nassim's fuck you money.
I thought we were going to tone the swearing down.
Yeah, but that's a special case. That's in the book, so I get a pass for that one.
Yeah, I'll give you a pass, and that means I must get a pass later on for just.
We'll see what you say.
For when it comes up.
What happens.
So the fuck you money. 1987, which is post study, post getting into the being a quant.
So a mathematical trader.
Yeah. So like. Guy that's focused around quantitative analysis and focused around financial markets and models and things, where he's like hedge fund manager, derivatives trader, and got to start to apply some of these theories of randomness to the market. But he's like, as part of like building this, however much money he made, and 87 was a big crash too. It was whatever crash it was.
Another big crash, and that's when he got rich.
Yeah, which was based around some of his ideas that was starting to really form around randomness and probability.
Really interesting that he made that money and then was able to say, okay, well, I've got enough. Now I'm going to stop working and spend more time thinking about this idea, and almost essentially, at least dedicate part of his time to actually thinking about trading and thinking about the ideas behind the trading and the theoretical ideas, and then develop that, read philosophy, develop all that, and integrate it together into these books and while he's still investing. So he kind of pulled the lever back on working in the traditional sense, I think. And that is actually compounded much, much more than what he would have if he just kept hacking it out like a lot of other people would have. Yeah. He kind of took a step back to go forward, I think. That's pretty powerful.
It's like the long game. He was playing the long game.
He was, yeah.
And
and he's almost certainly got a better life because of that.
I think there's like a quote from him that says, we're always told, to be open to everything. And he's like, I wish I was more stubborn. If I had my time again, I wish I was more stubborn. And we're always told to not procrastinate. I procrastinated for 30 years on the Black Swan so that I had time to, discover and explore and expand his way of thinking to enable sort of the pinnacle of the Black Swan. So he's like, if I was to do my time again, I'd be more stubborn and I'd procrastinate. It's like, what? This is so not down our self-help line of thinking.
Yeah, it comes, I wonder what triggered in my mind was that, how do you know when you know something? So an example would be, this book is very dense and has a lot of information in it. And how do you know when you know it?
Know it in the
Do you
sense of
understand my question?
being able to recall it, or know it in the sense of being able to like it is who you are.
Well, I think that's partly an answer to the question, is that I'm starting to try and recognize when I fully know something and making sure I stop and give myself time to understand it to the point where if I can, and I think one of the tests is, can you fully explain something to someone else? That gets thrown around a little bit, and I think it's true.
Yeah, in like 10 to 20 seconds type thing, explain an idea in 20 seconds.
But what it comes back to as well is that, well, how do you feel when you really know something, And when you get to the point where you actually fully know something, you kind of have internalized it to a point where you can kind of embody it in a way. That's pretty metaphysical maybe, but I think that it's about slowing down, and something I'm trying to learn over the years is that to give myself time to understand things like this fully. And I think that's part of his slowing down. And obviously this is such a revolutionary idea that he came up with that it took him 30 years. But even just reading this, I'm not sure I'm there yet with this.
I'm certainly not there.
I think I'm about halfway. So I'm going to keep revisiting it, thinking about it, talking to it, about with you, with others, trying to explain it to people until I know it to the point where I can really introduce it into my life fully.
Yeah. But I think about you getting to know it is also, on our topic before, we were talking about like how many books we're going to read this year.
Yeah.
And that's more from our perspective so that we can keep up with making episodes. But I don't think that's like the best approach either.
Well, I think there's a lot of ego in that.
Correct.
And I've definitely put my hand up. Like, I want to say I read 40 books. I know there's a part of me that says that I want to achieve that so I can kind of feel good about myself or something.
Yeah.
The less refined parts of me wants to put that flag in the ground.
But it's probably a pretty prominent part. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like, certainly it's for me.
Not afraid to admit that.
Yeah.
But you are right in the fact that you could probably just ruminate on 2 or 3 and get as much out of that. I'm not sure.
Because I think the core is that you intake some of this knowledge, whatever it is, and then you're explaining it to people, you're talking about people, but you're also practicing it. You're also like doing it, and there's that real sort of experiential learning, and then you get your own way of thinking about, your own perspective on what that idea is and what it means applied in your own life, and therefore you're better able to come back and explain it, because you've got that to draw on. You've got the sort of the story behind it.
Something I do get out of reading quite a lot as well is that I don't necessarily put too much pressure on myself to really retain an idea after I've read the book. Because I find over time it kind of pops up, and when I'm reading something else, you can connect the dots and say, that's just like that. You connect the 2 ideas from 2 different books or biographies or whatever, and you learn something from that connection. And a lot of the time it's just in there somewhere, and it's just got to sort of sit, and it'll come back as in a thematic way.
Yeah, something has to trigger it.
But a lot gets lost too, and I want to try and make sure, how do you get the most out of this? I don't know, you just keep going, I think.
I think it's about what kind of resonates at the time. And something that, you read this book today and then you read this book in 5 years' time, there'll be completely different things that are resonating, because you've kind of like, maybe you've like integrated some of the stuff, maybe you kind of know, as you say, the stuff that you didn't know last time. And so things look so much different. I go back looking at some books that I've read with like highlights and things on them. I'm like, why did I highlight this? This is like silly. This is dumb. This is so obvious. But at the time of reading that, there's probably a chance that it wasn't so obvious. But I think the point of that is the sort of experiential. And so touching on our man, he worked at like 10 different major institutions throughout his trading years before he retired, as he calls it, which was like Credit Suisse. This is when he was making his fuck you money, by the way. Credit Suisse, First Boston,
FU money,
bank. When you watch the I think the fireside chat or he's got other. I think he's got a talk at Google too, right? I think he's going to say bullshit, and he's like bull SH exclamation mark $.
He's been told not to swear.
Yeah, he's like, I'm not going to swear in public or something of that nature, but you can read it in the book. So we're going to refer to them as baloney. Where was I up to? CIBC, Wood Grundy, Deutsche Bank, which was called something else, and then heaps of others. And
so,
go.
When does he first write Fooled by Randomness and the Black Swan series? It takes him a little while after this to actually write these books.
Yeah, it takes him
another 10 plus years.
Yeah, ages,
even longer.
Ages. So we're looking, from like 19. Was the 86, 87 market crash, all the way through to the first release of Fooled by Randomness, which I think came out in the early 2000s. It's like 02, 03, somewhere around there. And then obviously Black Swan was not until 2007. But I think the most important thing to highlight the way that he did that, right, is that he first was a trader, where he says he learned that mathematicians and other people who model, that's the mathematicians that model, not mathematicians, are full of baloney. To tie back to that. And that we have a view of the formulas which we use, which is organic, bottom up. And he says that architects always do a better job when they use the bottom-up rules, not the top-down ones. So it's using like the core rules of geometry and stuff from a base level, as opposed to using some of the more macro theories and things around things. And starting as a trader enabled him to discover the bottom-up perspective from his own thoughts, and then also enabled him to, in the 2000 NASDAQ dive and the 07 GFC, he did so well both times.
So, interesting quote, most sciences came from technology, not technology coming from science. So this is at the core of his apprenticeship, doing his learning.
And pretty out there. Like, when I initially heard that, I was like, what?
Yeah.
No? But I guess a classic example of it is when we were back running around the fields and starting to look at moving around a little bit faster, and we wanted to get off our legs. I don't think we exactly invented the wheel by planning and designing
office
a wheel
drawing.
I suspect there was like a couple of logs that were kind of just started rolling somehow, and we decided to put some things on top of it. And
Flintstones.
We're running around in Flintstones cars.
So I think now would be a good point to jump in and come back to some of the rest of his life, but to talk about the Black Swan and a Black Swan event.
We haven't even explained what a Black Swan is.
It's been a solid build up though. It's really building the tension.
Really in anticipation.
Oh yeah.
So what is a Black Swan?
So the reason he calls Black Swan events is that throughout the years when the Europeans were still in Europe, the white swans were around, and it was thought that all swans are white. But when they actually travelled down to Australia and Oceania and those sort of regions exploring, they discovered that there were black swans. And then all of a sudden, not all swans were white. There were black swans as well as white swans. And it's kind of representative of his ideas of hidden risk, hidden items, and all swans are white until there is a black one. And so, but black swans always existed, we just hadn't observed them. So that's his kind of intro into the idea, but it's got a number of different facets to it.
Yeah, well, he says some of the kind of the main pieces of it is it's focused around kind of the silent evidence, which is like the not knowing that it exists or not knowing that it's there.
The 3/4 of the iceberg under the water.
That's it. And
if we don't see it, it doesn't mean it doesn't exist.
Correct.
So big hidden risks. People are not very good at recognizing those, and
nor do we want to.
No, that's an interesting point. It's tied into human nature too, isn't it?
Yeah.
And some of these thinking fast and slow ideas.
Yeah, we are risk averse, but we also want to tell ourselves the good story. You know, we want to tell ourselves that this will come off okay. This will come off.
Nothing bad's going
to happen to me until it does. And so the other really important facet of the Black Swan is that it's scalable. So it's like it's an event that can't be seen and then just kind of explodes out of nowhere. And then when it happens, it just continues.
So it's very hard to predict. It just happens and it has a huge effect, an outsized effect on something. So the financial crisis is a good point. Not many people saw that coming. A select few did. There was a huge hidden risk in what was happening in the subprime mortgage market. Everyone thought tomorrow was going to be the same as yesterday, and then all of a sudden it wasn't. And bang, an absolutely catastrophic event happened, way above the scale of what people thought was going to happen. But interestingly, afterwards, it's very interesting what happens, and this is the really, really big realization, is that everyone's got a narrative for why it happened after it happened, not before it happened.
Yeah, and there might have been a select few.
Humans want to explain things, right?
Yeah.
And so we feel that we can predict the future, and we go on in exactly the same way.
Well, we want to put things into like a succinct, coherent kind of narrative, as you say, which is kind of the narrative fallacy that he refers to.
So black swans events can be positive events and negative events. So Twitter is an example of a black swan event where there's 1,000 startups that are kind of semi-indistinguishable from one another, and one will end up being worth 100,000 times the other 85 or something. Yeah. And so there's an outsized event there that's very hard to tell at the outset that everyone would want to send each other 140 characters, but it's very explainable after the fact. It's part of human nature or whatever, but we don't really know what happened there. But the important point is that something did happen, and one of these things became massive.
Yeah. And then
we're kind of blind to it.
Yeah, and then we do the back look on it and go, so why did that happen? And it's kind of like this: the constraints enough around that kind of make it fit within a model that we have within our minds, which is where he talks about the ludic fallacy, which is that we sort of perceive and model things as if it's kind of within game theory itself, you know?
Within a game.
Or within a game, yeah.
So a closed system that of lower complexity.
Yeah, with like set constraints and set levers that you can pull and push.
Because we believe we control the world or fully understand it. We haven't over. Is that why?
I suspect we probably, there's overconfidence in what we do. And you get into a real sort of rabbit hole here, but that overconfidence comes from the historical positive, or positive, historical things that have happened. And so all the other things that were maybe some of the assumptions that went into these sort of games and models were totally unfounded originally, but just haven't been called out yet because we haven't hit a problem in the game of.
You start to see these everywhere. So I was in Sydney a couple of weeks ago and I was walking along the shore and I saw a fisherman on the rocks. And I feel like this is a great Black Swan example. It's probably not quite the level of randomness that you might say that is a Black Swan event, but people die fishing on the rocks all the time, right? And I was standing there watching, and this guy was pretty smart. He had a life jacket on and stuff like that, but God knows why he'd do it anyway. And 10 waves came in, lapping up. Another 10. One was slightly bigger than the other. They all fit in this nice little pattern. And then one doesn't. And that's what kills you. Because the next wave doesn't. It's bigger. Something's happened. The reaction between the wave coming back and the forces and the wave, the superimposing on the other one, there's one that's 10 times as big and it washes you off and kills you.
So I would say, right, the Black Swan in that event is you're doing your usual fishing, and there's 4 earthquakes that happen in the ocean just outside, totally all possible along some tectonic plates and things. And there is a massive tidal wave that comes in and not only wipes you the fuck out, but wipes out the entire town that you live in as well.
It's bloody horrible weather's weather's perfect example of a random, incredibly complex system that we can't predict far into the future. We do better now.
Mate, we have 4 seasons here in Melbourne.
But maybe that's an interesting part. Maybe that's an interesting part of the Black Swan is that, in a complex system, you can predict some things most of the time. But if you start looking far enough into the future, you actually can't, because the interactions between so many different things, it's impossible for us to compute that or fully understand it.
This is where he talks about forecasting degradation. And you kind of imagine that in a forecast you'll do like a kind of like a lower bound. I don't want to get too technical, and like an upper bound, and kind of like this is where we expect things to fit within. But as soon as you have all these assumptions that are going into each of those, the upper bound and lower bound, and all the other predictions that are happening in between those, like the best event and the worst event, and all these assumptions that are going in between within each of those different situations, as soon as one of those assumptions is off, then the entire thing changes. Mm-hmm. And that happens at every single instance in time throughout the entire forecast. So it's not about, oh shit, we messed up our forecast, let's reforecast it. No, we need to go back and go, what were the assumptions that we put into this forecast, and which of those do we need to change to try and make this sort of range of forecasting better in the long run? But at the same time, you're still subject to the similar degradation that happens across time.
You have to compare it to real world results. That is your best bet to predicting something properly. But even then, you're still subject to crazy things happening that are really really low probability, but massive impact if they do happen. And they will happen given a long enough period of time. And it happens in everyone's life in really interesting ways. And we kind of understand some of it. That's why we have insurance, but we don't give it enough credo and we believe we can explain everything in a simple way. It's not possible.
Mm.
So how can you actually use this is a really interesting question.
Mm.
How can you actually interpret that information? The first thing you can do is listen or read to this book to start yourself actually thinking about it, because we're not going to cover even a fifth of it. But
Mate, I think we're going to cover 0.5% of it.
But I believe it's probably the best thing that I've kind of tried to take from this is that don't be afraid to make tiny losses often for the possibility of a big gain. And conversely, be aware of hidden risks that you don't really think about that could happen, and try not to be in things that have exposure in any form of life. Do your best to not have exposure to things that are going to go really bad if something really unlikely happens.
So what kind of things would you say?
So let's explain it in the sense of his barbell investment strategy, and we can apply this to...
That comes out in later, doesn't it?
He mentions it a little bit in this book, but he doesn't delve into it. It's more in the other books.
Skin in the Game, I think, is where it comes out.
So this is how he made all his money. So he won't really invest a lot of money in what we would describe as really good, solid investments, like in Australia buying the Commonwealth Bank or something along those lines. Some
Woolies,
of those, BHP or something like that. He wouldn't be investing in the top 100 stocks, because to him there's massive downside risk in those. When something like the GFC happens, they'll take a 50-60% hit, or not all of them, but you're exposed to losses. Instead, he'll have most of his money in something like the US dollar or something as safe as you can get. He'll keep the large portion of his finances in really, really super, super safe assets, which seem pretty boring to us because they don't actually get much of a return. So
it's kind of like, why am I going to throw my money into that?
Yeah. But he'll put, say, 10%, I don't know the percentages, but let's, for argument's sake, say 10% in things that are almost certainly going to lose. For example, he might invest in some cryptocurrency. He might be buying things like investing in some really crazy startups or super speculative stocks. And he's willing to lose a little bit every day so that once in 15 years, he wins so much that he can basically write off all those little losses. And this is the idea behind venture capital too. So, but that's hard, okay? It's really hard to cop that because we hate volatility as people. It's just ingrained into us. Not everyone does, but most do. So that makes me feel really bad because I'm going to look at my stocks every day. I'm not going to see it going up 6%. I'm going to see my money going backwards in the bank because of inflation, and I'm going to be taking all these little losses and never knowing if I'm actually going to win. But it's actually a really clever strategy. So if you can apply some of that to your life in some ways and try and make sure the majority of what you're doing is looking for hidden risks and staying away from them. And when you are doing things, make sure you're exposing yourself to something that can really benefit you in, 10 times, 30 times what you think, but cause you a little bit pain in the short term.
Yeah. And it's probably worth highlighting there that just because he's betting on some speculative things doesn't mean that he is just gambling his money away either.
Oh, he's got a system for that. Yeah.
The stuff the 10% that he's investing in, he knows the ins and outs of, say, that company. He knows the ins and outs of that market. He knows he's got, I hate using the word model, but he's got his own models for how he looks at these things. And so it's not just a gamble. It's a well-informed, or as well-informed as possibly can be, given his availability of information and knowledge to invest in that particular thing. I was going to say that's just on that information thing too. He does talk about like how toxic information can be though. Because information can be received in different ways and articulated in different ways to make us think a fact, a truth about something, when in fact that is not the truth. And what can happen is he talks about that with more information, our chance of reducing uncertainty, or our chance of being, right in a bet, is not actually changed, or not necessarily changed. But what does change is our confidence. And so you see the amount or the chance that we have of getting a better outcome might marginally go up, but our confidence exponentially goes up as a result.
Yeah. So it can lead you down the wrong path. And so be really careful about who you listen to, is one of the things that I'm trying to take away from this. Is just a lot of people don't listen to 30-year projections of the oil price, or it's just bullshit.
I bet you the 30-year projections of the oil price wouldn't have predicted data being the most expensive commodity on the face of the earth at this point in time. Things are really complicated. So, I was watching this video this morning of this guy. It's awesome. He's awesome, by the way, who stands in his living room. Who is this guy?
And
it's not you filming yourself, is it?
Check me out. He's in a bathrobe. He's got a keyboard and a loop machine, and he live streams himself, and people chat to him and give him requests. So, and then he'll start singing and playing the keyboard depending on what your request is. I did a little bit of reading about him because he's a pretty interesting dude. Mark Ribulet, check him out. He quit his job. That's his job. Could you have predicted that 10 years ago? Not a chance, There's 1,000 reasons why you can do that.
I follow
that came together.
Yeah,
right?
I follow a guy on Instagram, and all he does is work out. He makes these funny kind of workout videos, and he runs around like a horse's head and does these strange things. This sounds really Juji Mufu, I think.
Okay,
I think
check that out.
He does some funny stuff, and he's huge. But this is what he does. He just goes on these random adventures, mostly focused around lifting weights, and that is what he does. And he posts it on Instagram and I imagine some of the other platforms. He's got a massive following.
Yeah. So, but if I'm trying to think, if I think about Mark Ribulet, or I almost tipped a glass over. What's the guy's name?
We nearly lost all our recording equipment, mate.
Jeez.
This is the best money I've ever spent. This thing.
So, what's this fella's name who does the workouts?
I think I'm going to get this wrong.
I'm going to go with Juji Fruit.
Juji Mifu.
Juji Mifu.
It's
a tough one to say.
I'm going to find out.
So you can kind of explain why he's, it's kind of, you go, oh, well, Instagram was invented and it got popular on the internet, and it was you can kind of convince yourself for a narrative that you kind of understand why it happened. But if you really think about it, you kind of don't. And you can prove that by saying, okay, what's the new job that's going to be in 15, what's going to be happening 15 years from now? You write down a piece of paper, an absolutely very, very small chance that you'll have got it predicted the new crazy thing that you could do then.
Predictability. Juji Mufu.
Cool. I'll check
him out.
So I got a question. So you can make money from investing in blue chip stocks, though. You don't have to follow this all the way down the rabbit hole like he has, do you?
Well, I think this gets back to your comment before, right? Which is, you like selectively listening to things, or selectively watching, or taking things in, or choosing what you believe to be true. And it's all around like the critical thinking element, right? I think the importance coming out of that type, this book is, and the prevalence of uncertainty is that people, it's encouragement to do your own critical thinking and not just take everything as gospel, but actually have a good think about it yourself. So in the sense of making, blue chip money, the classic, Warren Buffett throwaway line is like, just invest in indices. They go up 10% across their life, across 30 years, that type of thing.
Okay. So what I'd say about that, first of all, is that he's making a few assumptions there. Turns out they've been correct, but first of all, that America is going to hang around, that the stock market is going to still be there, that, you could list 5 or 6 others that maybe I don't know, but I'm going to, you get my theme here.
Well, what's the classic, mate, is the top 100 companies in the US in like the 1900s was still around like actually, let's not use anything let's use post-World War II, like say 1950s to
Black Swan event.
Whatever it was, 1990s, no change. But now every 5-10 years, we get cycling through of massive numbers in those top 100. You see massive corporations just completely non-existent off the face of the earth, or have been totally consolidated within others.
So the indices allows for that, doesn't it?
Correct.
But so what could have happened to Warren Buffett is that his advice might not be correct if the low risk but massive impact thing happened where America had a second civil war and tore itself apart and had a socialist revolution. Or the US dollar was no longer a currency, Bitcoin took over, pick your fantasy. But it is predicated on some things that have very small risk that something could happen that makes them null and void. That's Nassim's point. So and I guess it comes back to, just knowing that this is a phenomenon that can happen actually reduces the risk. You kind of know what you're going in with your eyes open, I guess.
Yeah.
Isn't it? That's my belief.
I was going to say because I was thinking about this. I'm like, so how do you actually then put this in? How do you it's similar to like, say, thinking fast and slow again. I hate to come back to it, but it's like, oh, now that I know it, I'm aware of it, I can start to deal with and work through with this. You want to pause?
Yeah.
You're out of battery?
It's about to die.
So is mine.
Is it?
That's a pause. Yeah, it's plugged in. So just... change on the front. Recording. Is yours dead?
No, but it's close. So maybe
Mine's like flashing, so
Yeah, mine's flashing too. So
let's.
well, if we're about 1:10, so we'll just. Do you want to just knock out 10 more minutes and?
I was going to say my like integrations. What?
Well, I was thinking of going back to the bio quickly, finishing that. You could finish that, and then we wrap up with how we'd use it
Sure.
as a different way of kind of.
I did want to talk about fucking the gamification of the world.
You did though.
Yeah, but
Not deep
we
enough.
didn't get. Anyway, it doesn't matter. Let's move
We've
on.
gone deep on a few things. It's been good. I feel like the energy's good too. So how do we pick this back up?
What were we last talking about?
I'll just start by asking you a question, and that can can cut it back at the point before.
What were we talking about?
I don't
You
know.
just spoke about blue chip and
We were
indices, and
Yeah, and then it went to hidden risk, and
I was literally about to say what I've been thinking about. Yeah, so I was saying I've been thinking about this.
all right, go for it.
So I've been thinking about this, right? And I hate to bring it up again, but like thinking fast and slow, because there's all the bias and all the heuristics that are sort of explored in that book, and similarly in this book. It's all well and good to know about them and be aware of them, but it doesn't really actually help you implement them. I think certainly awareness is like an important thing, because you're certainly not going to make any steps in the right direction without the awareness.
That's interesting, but it's only step one, is what you're saying.
Yeah, I think
What's the second step?
well, that's what I've been trying to think about, is how you sort of then start integrating this into daily life. And so it's, simply being more aware means that you can kind of trigger maybe at different points throughout your day and being like, oh, okay.
Or you
cool.
can put a checklist system in to prompt you, right?
Correct.
That's probably the better,
Every time.
the most foolproof way to try and protect against these things that you will do.
Yeah. But that needs to be in every situation that you, because I think there's like a checklist, right? Which is like in some of the more directed things and process orientated things you're doing. But I think there's also like you need to know it, similar to what we were talking about a while ago. So I think the biggest thing that I got out of this, right, is tying back to his whole philosophy around how important the bottom-up approach is, and the importance of like first principles as to what happens down here at the basal layer, what happens here on the ground. And so a real tangible thing that I'm going to do is start looking back into microeconomics and just like getting an understanding of some of those core mechanisms and how things
That
work.
add up to make the whole.
Correct.
But the thing with that, though, is that I think a lot of what he's saying as well is that you need to have trust empirical evidence more than modeled theories from the ground up. So how do those two things work together? Because, take forecasting, for example. You're much better to figure out what the last bridge cost you to build, or the last 30, and use that instead of just piecing together, well, I'm going to go out there and I'm going to put the piers in, sorry for the technical, I'm going to put the piles in the ground, then I'm going to build the supports, and then I'm going to put the bridge on the top. Yeah. Because you're not factoring in the complexity with the model. So I think the terminology's got to be, if you're trying to predict something, you need to use past evidence, which I would call top-down forecasting in my terminology. But to kind of understand something, you need to understand the very, very micro.
I think the top down.
Confusing myself.
Yeah. The top down, Because the top down is like the general feel and trend for how things are happening. And so we project down as to, this is kind of like an overarching theme. Therefore, this kind of trickles down and applies at a lower level, as opposed to like that real basal build up. The important thing to recognize in the sort of model thing that you were talking about before, where, you know, these models are built up from the ground. Well, they're not actually built up from the ground. They're started at
in the middle somewhere,
a couple of tiers up.
Yeah, gotcha.
Because there's all these assumptions going into them, and that's where the kind of discrepancy happens.
I understand what you're saying.
And so you're drawing back on these.
So that's why you need to do things and feel them and understand them. So you are at the bottom. You truly are at the bottom when you're understanding those things, aren't you?
There's a lot that we pick up through the subconscious, experiential nature of doing things. So pretty damn interesting, mate.
So the rest of his life, post writing The Black Swan, he's kind of flooded in and out of being an academic and making money, and
becoming an academic was his retirement, as he calls it.
Right.
This is
but
when
he hates academics.
Yeah.
Because he thinks they're the ones who create all these models that don't matter and aren't out in the real world understanding it, right?
Yeah, I think there's a few
gamification.
There's a few gripes he has. There's one that he sees there's no risk. Sure, there's risk, but he's very he uses a lot of hyperbole in how he speaks. So he says there's no risk in academia because you're only judged by your peers. You're not
skin in the game.
There's no skin in the game.
You're not in there.
You're not putting yourself out there.
You're not affected by the outcome.
To the end outcome, and the end sort of consumer or customer or whatever it is that's impacted. He also talks about that the other issue is because there's a lot of people in that game that have pursued these things for decades. What do you think the chances of someone pursuing something for decades and then going, all my work was a load of shit?
Oops. Too much ego. Yeah. Plus, there's like, if you look at the talking heads on TV that are academics or whatever, there's actually no, economists are a great example. There's no real penalty for being wrong. No one, CNN don't call them up next week and get them back on and go, hey, yeah, what you told me was complete rubbish. Yeah, that doesn't happen. You just get to have the hot take and move forward, because it's kind of... So, yeah, there is no skin in the game feedback loop in that either. Well,
taking it to the extreme level, mate, you look at, again, the GFC. Did any of the big bosses really cop anything for that?
So, do they actually have skin in the game?
People made some of these guys made hundreds of millions of dollars off of that.
God.
Which was then, I don't know how trillions of dollars of bailout.
People are angry. God. It's just horrible.
Causes a massive divide.
So he started up a real world risk institute.
Yeah.
He's really trying to get his ideas out there, isn't he?
He started this with someone else, and this is like the real world rigor approach. I think it's an executive certification thing, but hopefully it's helping to truly inform.
Be great to do something like that.
Yeah, to change the game from this wholly protected situation. I'm not saying that people should be going to jail just because there's some mistakes that are made. But if there's like negligence and corruption and things like that are like, and there's been many opportunities to look at the you as that person heading that up, look at your own integrity throughout that process and go, hang on, is this right? That's where there should be, some serious punishment involved.
And he spends most of his time being an academic, talking and writing.
Yeah, I think his writing is where he shines.
He writes really dense academic papers and more consumable stuff like these books.
Yeah.
and splits his time between those.
Yeah. Like very palatable stuff, this, and then all the way to we just lost one of our
camera
cameras.
too. Got to buy that second charger.
So yeah, he spends his time going between the sort of real quantitative, still risk mitigation approach to things, and he also spends time talking in the more like generalities of his concepts and trying to bring them down to be every person.
So the 5 books: Fooled by Randomness, The Black Swan, which we're talking about today, The Bed of Proscuties. Jeez, I struggle with that.
Procrustes.
Thank you. Antifragile, Skin in the Game. So that story's
I
interesting.
think it's actually Procrusti.
Procrusti, where he has the bed and he's got a bed that the travelers come to. And
Have you read this?
no, it's just a story that it's like a tale. I think it's from Greek mythology. This is, if I'm wrong, I'm wrong. I'm just going to go for this. And there's
Have confidence.
It's a bed, and the traveller turns up, and instead of accepting that people are different heights, he puts the people on the bed and he stretches them out to be the same size as the bed. Or if the next traveller comes along, he puts the traveller on it and shrinks him down so he fits in the bed. So that the idea being that he's got this idea that people fit in this bed, and then he changes the evidence to fit his idea.
Yeah.
And so apparently he's written a whole book about that. And if you want a proper explanation of that, you should just go look that thing up instead of listening to this.
It's a pretty small book though. That book. It's like whatever an in between a book and an article is in size. I can't remember what they call it.
So everyone says the other books are really valuable too. I'd love to get around to them one day, and I'm sure certainly will. But The Black Swan's the star of this series. It was named one of the 12 most influential books since World War II by the Sunday Times, and he's basically become a rock star because of it. Even Daniel Kahneman likes him.
We brought him up like 5 times this episode.
Yeah, which he's a star. And yeah, and Taleb likes Kahneman too. So there you go. That validates his points of view as well. So
or are they just cross-pollinating in their academia?
patting each other's backs, maybe. But the bottom line is, get a hold of this thing, listen to it, read it, and tell us what you think.
Good stuff.
Thank you.